Why does Indonesia matter to Australia? Why should we care about their policies and their prospects? When you think about Indonesia, are the first things that come to mind terrorism, extremism, natural disasters, maybe even Chappelle Corby? Our large northern neighbour has often loomed in the imaginations of Australians, but usually for the wrong reasons. However, over the past decade, Indonesia has undergone a rapid transition. At a time when its neighbours Thailand and the Philippines began to lose their tenuous grasp on democracy, Indonesians began to experience free elections, decentralised government, freer media, and a resurgent civil society. Indonesia is emerging as an economic power. With a population of about 230 million, the fourth largest in the world, Indonesia has a massive emerging consumer market. Throughout the global financial crisis, it posted growth rates of between 6 and 7%. In January, Moody's upgraded Indonesia's credit rating to one notch below investment grade. And a new report from Citibank predicts that by 2050, its GDP will match that of Germany, France, Italy, and Britain combined. Indonesia now accounts for 13% of global coal exports and has large untapped gas reserves. Like Australia, it's riding the natural resources boom on the coattails of Chinese growth. With a young population and a growing workforce, it's also about to hit that demographic sweet spot. Indonesia is also positioning itself as the diplomatic power in Southeast Asia. It's a member of the G20, and despite whatever misgivings you might have about that organisation, this gives it a seat at the table with the world's biggest powers. This year it's taken up the rotating chair of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, which it requested to take up 2 years early. Jakarta is using this opportunity to promote itself as the unofficial leader of the group, a position it held throughout the Suharto era. Indonesia is enjoying closer relations with America, India, Japan, and Australia. Our 2008 Defence White Paper was the first to be overtly positive about Indonesia, calling it a strong partner for Australia. And the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's 2011 Strategic Assessment, released just last week, notes that Australia now wants Indonesia to take on a larger role as a security contributor in Asia. So this is why we should be focusing on Indonesia. It's a huge country, right on our doorstep, a functioning democracy, an emerging major economy, and a friend of our friends. For perhaps the first time, our political, economic, and diplomatic interests are almost exactly aligned. Yet in the past we've been often so quick to dismiss it as a country of terrorists and volcanoes. Tonight, the focus is going to be on Indonesia's foreign policy. The power balance in our region is changing quickly, quicker than most analysts imagined even a few years ago. I'm going to discuss what Indonesia's strategic role in this rapidly changing environment might be, and many of the ideas came from my recent report which John discussed. After that, I'd like to change tack somewhat. After opening the presentation by telling you all how wonderful Indonesia is, I'm going to scare you by talking about some of the many problems within Indonesia that could threaten to derail this progress. Indonesia's foreign policy is characterised by a series of balancing acts. The first is between America, which is still the preponderant military power in the region, and China, which might begin to challenge America's primacy at some stage over the next few decades. Indonesia wants to maintain good relations with the two, but ultimately it feels more comfortable with America being the most powerful state in the system than it does with China taking on this role. For this reason, Indonesia's relationship with China is also a balancing act. On the one hand, Indonesia's economic future is inextricably linked to China's. More than anything, Indonesia wants China to see it as an attractive investment destination. And it also wants to keep diplomatic relations with China strong, just in case China does go on to become the dominant regional power. But on the other hand, Indonesia is also quite wary of this eventuating. China is a power that has stated ambitions beyond its own territorial borders. Think of Taiwan. And Indonesia knows that China does see many of the seas around it as strategically significant. Indonesia is nervous about a future where China may be able to throw its weight around. Indonesia's relationship with the United States is also a balancing act. To assuage its anxieties about China's rise, Indonesia, like many of its neighbours, is very keen to ensure that America retains an active presence in the region. Indonesia knows that without the support of the US, the relatively small states of Southeast Asia don't have that much of a chance of standing up to what may be an increasingly assertive China. But at the same time, Indonesia is wary of becoming too dependent on the US. It has a proud history of non-alignment, and its colonial past makes it very reticent to accept what it sees as too much domination by great powers. Jakarta wants to play a bigger role in the diplomatic fabric of the region, and how well it handles this series of balancing acts will determine what role it's really able to play. Now, that was just a brief summary of some of my main conclusions, but before going any further, it's probably worth just jumping back for a quick history lesson. This won't be news to a lot of you, but it does help put some of Indonesia's current dealings with both China and America into a bit of context. Indonesia's first president, Sukarno, was a nationalist who rallied against Dutch colonialism. Although he was socialist in inclination, his overriding foreign policy philosophy was one of non-alignment. Indonesia's next leader, Suharto, came to power on the back of a botched coup in 1965, the details of which are still hotly debated. Suharto was a military general and a staunch anti-communist, and he claimed that the coup was orchestrated by the Indonesian Communist Party. He used this as a justification to seize power, and over the next few years an estimated 500,000 Communist Party members and suspected sympathisers were killed. Suharto suspected that China had funded and helped plan the coup, and he immediately cut relations with China. These weren't fully restored again until 1990, 25 years later. With the Vietnam War raging, and politicians throughout the West enthralled with the domino theory, the United States was happy to have a staunch anti-communist leader in Southeast Asia. For his part, Suharto was happy to also have the US as a friend, and America became a major supplier of arms and military equipment to Indonesia. Yet again, Suharto still remained wary of being dominated too much by the US. This anxiety about being dominated by great powers was also at the heart of the founding of ASEAN in 1967. Along with Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand and Brunei, Indonesia was a founding member. And as the largest state in Southeast Asia, it quickly became something of a de facto leader of the group. Unlike the EU and its predecessors, which were really formed with the idea of keeping the big powers of Europe in, one of the real reasons for founding ASEAN was keeping the big Cold War powers, America and the USSR, out. The original 5 ASEAN states thought that by banding together, they'd have a much better chance of standing up to the great powers. They looked across to their neighbours in Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos and thought, we really don't want to be pawns in the Cold War. So in a sense, Indonesia's history of multilateral cooperation can be seen in this context of attempts to balance between the great powers while also maintaining independence from them. And this is a theme which is recurrent throughout Indonesia's foreign policy and which we'll keep returning to tonight. Suharto often suppressed political consent, often brutally controlled his people and oversaw a hugely corrupt administration, but he did gain some legitimacy both within Indonesia and outside of it from the fact that the Indonesian economy performed so well under his watch. Between the mid-1970s and 1990, per capita GDP doubled. So then it was little surprise that the Indonesian people turned against him so swiftly when the economy began to nosedive in 1997, thanks to the Asian financial crisis. Students and ordinary Indonesians took to the streets to protest massive spikes in the price of rice and fuel. Over the course of 1997-98, inflation hit somewhere between 60 and 70%. Rioters in Indonesia also targeted Chinese businesses and attacked ethnic Chinese people, even though many of their families had been in Indonesia for generations. While Suharto had nurtured a special animosity for China throughout his presidency, he did allow a small group of elite ethnic Chinese businessmen to benefit from what his detractors called Suharto's legacy of corruption, collusion and nepotism. This episode really demonstrates the long history of animosity towards Chinese by Indonesians, and many argue that this is yet to be overcome. 2.5 weeks after the riots began, Suharto was forced to hand power over to his deputy, B.J. Habibie. And just incidentally, this is exactly the same time as it took for the Egyptian president Mubarak to be forced from power only a few weeks ago. Indonesian watchers around the world speculated that the fall of the strongman would lead to a balkanisation of Indonesia, as smaller states and ethnic minorities broke away from the dominance of the central island of Java. But instead of clamping down on dissent, Habibie surprised onlookers by devolving much of Jakarta's administrative power to the regions, lifting a cap on the number of political parties that were allowed, releasing political prisoners, and lifting controls on the media. He called for a referendum on the future of East Timor, and in 1999 he allowed the first legislative elections in Indonesia to take place since 1955. Unexpectedly, Indonesia had become a democracy. Over the past decade, democracy's become more ingrained. The transition has been rocky. Many of Indonesia's fundamental problems have not been solved, and many more have arisen since then, and we'll turn to these a bit later. But since 2005, the charismatic and moderate ex-general Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono has held the top job, and he's been credited with bringing some much-needed stability to Indonesia's often chaotic political system. So while Sukarno leaned towards China, and Suharto towards the USA, in the post-Suharto era, Jakarta has maintained solid relations with both. The balancing act between these two powers that Indonesia now faces is not just a product of the changing balance of power in the region, but it's also significantly a product of changes within Indonesia itself. The Yudhoyono government has been assiduous in trying to move beyond this either-or paradigm. In fact, its worst nightmare now would be if it was forced to choose sides between America and China. Yet it's still saddled with this history of rocky relations with both of these two powers. So it's back to these two relationships that we'll now turn. In the post-Suharto period, Indonesia's ties with China have improved remarkably, but we have to remember they were coming off a pretty low base. Despite the two states signing a strategic partnership in 2005, the economic relationship remains much stronger than any security ties. Between 2005 and 2009, two-way trade doubled to $25 billion on the back of booming Indonesian exports of oil, coal and LNG to China. Yet despite this relationship developing in leaps and bounds, Indonesia still worries about a future where China may come to dominate the region. It worries that its natural resources and its geographic location mean that Indonesia will increasingly be of strategic interest to China as it grows. In mid-2009, an Indonesian Defence Ministry spokesman outlined his country's 3 security priorities: the South China Sea, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and the Malacca Strait. And we're going to take a look at each of these in turn. There's a series of long-running territorial disputes over parts of the South China Sea, especially around the resource-rich Spratly and Paracel Islands. And countries disputing are China, Taiwan, Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei, and the Philippines. There have been a number of flare-ups over the years, such as in 1999 when China began building structures on the Mischief Reef, which was claimed by the Philippines, and Manila claimed that China could be using these to establish military facilities. So why are all these states so keen to establish these claims over the sea? As you can see from the map, apart from the area being very rich in natural resources, the sea is also strategically significant. Geographically, it sits at the heart of Asia and forms a maritime bridge between Southeast Asia and the Northeast Asian states of China, Japan, and South Korea. It's one of those vital sea lanes of communication that allows these countries to import and export goods. If any one state controls the sea, they can effectively control commercial and naval shipping throughout Asia. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that any of these claimant states wants to control the sea, but similarly, they don't want their neighbours to be in a position where they can control it and deny them access either. But China's growing naval power, along with its increasingly assertive language about the sea, has the Southeast Asian states worried that one day China may be in a position to put some muscle behind its claims. In 2010, a Chinese spokesman reportedly said that the sea would now be considered a core interest, putting it on a par with Taiwan and Tibet as top security priorities for Beijing. The Chinese government has still since backed away from this statement, but this hasn't necessarily done that much to calm the frayed nerves of some of the other claimant states. Indonesia doesn't lay claim to either the Spratly or Paracel Islands, and it's positioning itself as an honest broker in the disputes. Jakarta is using its chairmanship of ASEAN to push China and the Southeast Asian states to sign a binding code of conduct, which will prohibit them from acting on their claims in the sea. And Indonesia was also quick to get behind an offer by Hillary Clinton to mediate in the disputes, knowing that the Southeast Asian claimants would benefit from having a powerful friend on side. But while Indonesia does see this as an opportunity to enhance its diplomatic prestige and shore up its leadership credentials within ASEAN, it's not really a completely objective broker. China quietly made a claim over Indonesia's Natuna Islands at the bottom of the South China Sea in 1993. Now, Jakarta never formally responded to the claim. The Suharto government thought that to do so would add legitimacy to it. But since then, Chinese maps of its territorial claims in the South China Sea have included parts of Indonesia's exclusive economic zone around the Natunas. In 2009, Indonesia detained 75 Chinese fishermen operating in the area. Indonesia fears that if China were able to gain a foothold in the Spratly and Paracel Islands, it would be in a better position to assert its claims over the Natunas. This issue highlights perfectly the balancing act inherent within Indonesia's relationship with China. Under the seabed is a large and mostly untapped LNG deposit. It's thought that about a quarter of Indonesia's recoverable natural gas supply could lie in the area, and Indonesia's welcomed Chinese investment in the gas project. And here we can see Indonesia's security and economic interests coming into really direct conflict. Hence its eagerness to have the whole issue settled quickly and amicably. Yet given the seemingly intractable nature of the debate, most analysts agree that this is very optimistic. However, it's nevertheless a really good example of how this balancing act and Indonesia's competing foreign policy priorities come into play. Moving further west, Indonesia's next security priority is the 900-kilometre-long Malacca Strait. This thin waterway separates Indonesia's Sumatra Island from Singapore and Malaysia, and at its narrowest point is only 2.6 kilometres wide. The strait is considered to be one of two global oil transit choke points, the other being in the Persian Gulf. Every day, 15 million barrels of oil are transported through the strait, including 80% of China's oil imports. Each year, 50,000 vessels travel through the strait, and this accounts for a quarter of the world's traded goods. So as you can see, the big powers are very interested in what happens in this thin little body of water. Piracy's long been a problem. In 2004, there were 38 attempted or actual attacks against ships by pirates, and this prompted Indonesia, along with Malaysia and Singapore, to launch a series of joint patrols in the strait. This was really an unprecedented level of cooperation between these neighbours, and it did lead to a marked drop in the incidents of piracy. They've been on their way down ever since 2004. But these patrols serve another purpose as well. They send a message to bigger powers who might be worried about the security of the sea lanes that Indonesia and its neighbours have the situation under control. The Chinese government has openly said that it would be prepared to protect its shipping interests with force if the strait was closed to it, or if it felt that its ships' security and safety could not be guaranteed. Indonesia, along with Malaysia and Singapore, don't want to give China any excuse to do this. Having PLA Navy ships plying its coast is Jakarta's worst security nightmare. Yet unlike in the South China Sea disputes, Indonesia's been less willing to accept the intervention of outside powers. Apart from China, the US, India, Japan and Australia have all offered assistance in securing the strait. Apart from accepting technical help, all these offers have been rebuffed. In fact, there was a minor diplomatic scuffle in 2004 when false reports suggested that the US would begin sending patrol boats to the strait. Indonesia and Malaysia were very quick to react, and very angrily too. Indonesia really does not want any foreign power's navy operating right on their doorstep. Moving further west still, to the Indian Ocean, the third security priority highlighted by the Indonesian Defence Ministry is the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. This island group is actually undisputed Indian territory, but it lays only 200 kilometres from the tip of Indonesia. The islands form something of a gateway to the Malacca Strait and the South China Sea through to the Indian Ocean on the west, and both Indonesia and India have a really shared interest in keeping the waters around the islands safe for shipping. If strategic competition between China and India emerges and intensifies in future decades, as many defence strategists suggest it will, this could become a potentially important area of security cooperation for India and Indonesia. The two countries have been carefully building a much closer relationship. Many aspects of their history are shared. They're both former colonies that were both not aligned during the Cold War. They're both now democracies, in fact the first and third largest democracies in the world. They're both emerging economies. They're both keen on seeing the benefits of increased trade with China, but at the same time they're both uneasy about what its rise might mean. And they're both building closer relations with the United States to try and balance against this growing power. In January, President Yudhoyono was invited to be the guest of honour at India's Republic Day ceremony, and this highlights the growing importance of the relationship both for Indonesia and India. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands are an area of potential future security concern for Jakarta, but this will be in the context of collaboration with India rather than competition against it. The subtext underlining these three areas is Indonesia's anxiety about what China's rise could mean for the security of the region. Ultimately, Indonesia worries that China may one day have the means to expand its reach around maritime Southeast Asia to protect its shipping interests. For Jakarta, this is where the US comes in. We've already touched on the role of America in both Indonesia's history and in some of its security concerns in the South China Sea, so now let's go in and tie it all together. As I mentioned earlier, Indonesia, under the staunchly anti-communist Suharto, had a good relationship with the US. But with the end of the Cold War, Washington became less accepting of Indonesia's, and particularly the Indonesian military's, human rights abuses. Following the notorious Santa Cruz massacre in East Timor in 1992, the Pentagon largely cut military relations with the Indonesian armed forces. In fact, the independence of East Timor came about partly because America, along with Australia, changed tack and began to put pressure on Jakarta. After the first Bali bombings in 2002, the US re-established some military contact, but this was largely in the context of anti-terror operations and policing. However, in 2005, Washington again re-established formal military ties. Just last year, it recommenced training with Kopassus, the notorious Indonesian Special Forces unit that was accused of the worst of the human rights abuses in East Timor. As we've discussed earlier, there's no doubt that Indonesia is keen to keep America engaged in the region, especially when it comes to strategic and security matters. But from this history, we can see that this newfound closeness is far from one-sided. In fact, there's been a distinct warming on the American side in terms of the relationship. This is part of a wider American strategy of strengthening engagement in Asia. Now, it's partly because the Obama administration feels like Asia was neglected by Bush, who was focused on the Middle East and the war on terror. Partly it also comes from the fact that Indonesia is now a democracy, and 2005 America's re-engagement did coincide with the Bush doctrine of democracy promotion. But it's also undoubtedly because China has grown in power much more rapidly than anyone expected, and America does now see it as a credible potential challenger to its strategic primacy in the region. America's relative power may be slowly declining, but it certainly doesn't want to give the impression it's withdrawing from the region. For its part, Indonesia clearly appreciates the importance of what's known as the hub and spokes model, a security architecture in which the US is at the centre and it's tied to the Asian states through a series of bilateral security relationships. Ultimately, Indonesia would like to see this model preserved. America's military presence in the Asia-Pacific has so far been a reasonably good guarantee of regional security, and Indonesia, along with many of its neighbours, has seen this history and is now confident that the US doesn't pose any security threat to them. However, we must again turn back to this question of balance. We talked about how Indonesia, in its relationship with China, balances its economic interests along with its security anxieties. Its relationship with the United States is also a balance. But this time, the balance is between keeping America engaged in the region without allowing it too much dominance. Ultimately, Indonesia does not want to have to choose sides between China and America, and it does not want to be seen as prioritising the American relationship over China. It definitely does not want any kind of security competition to emerge between the two, and in public it always talks down the prospect of this happening. As messy as this situation is, it's actually pretty much ideal for Indonesia. It can build economic ties with China and get lifted up by the rising tide of China's growth. But it really doesn't need to worry too much about any immediate security threats coming from China, because it knows that China is constrained in its actions by the presence of the much more powerful United States. Indonesia can even play the two off against each other, as China and the US compete for influence in the region. It's a very delicate tightrope act, but it's actually one that Indonesia is playing remarkably well. One way it's doing this is through multilateral forums such as ASEAN. So far, we've talked only about Indonesia's bilateral relationships with the two biggest powers in the region. And foreign policy realists do tend to write off the importance of multilateral institutions. But in this case, Indonesia is using these forums not just as a way to deepen cooperation with its neighbours, but also as a tool to manage its relationships with the major powers. Jakarta's been enthusiastic about the participation of both China and the United States in forums such as the ASEAN Regional Forum and the East Asia Summit. And this serves a few different purposes. First of all, Indonesia hopes that by keeping China engaged in these forums, it will be forced to adhere more closely to agreed regional norms. This is one reason why it wants ASEAN to negotiate with China over the South China Sea rather than individual ASEAN member countries. It hopes that this means that China might somehow be bound by ASEAN's principles of non-aggression. Secondly, Indonesia hopes that America's presence will balance out the heavy weight of China in these regions and effectively, in disputes like the South China Sea, give the Southeast Asian countries a pretty scary friend on side. And finally, Indonesia knows that the Southeast Asian states can in a way punch above their weight if they deal with these great powers in an ASEAN-sponsored forum rather than individually. Some commentators had begun to say over the last few years that Indonesia had outgrown ASEAN, but after taking on the chair this year, Jakarta's really thrown itself into the forum with great enthusiasm. They've vowed to take on the South China Sea issue, move ASEAN closer towards being a full economic community, and intervened in a border clash between Thailand and Cambodia. So it's a pretty big agenda that they've got. So Indonesia really does see itself now as being at the diplomatic centre of Southeast Asia. But many problems still do exist. The topic of tonight is about what role Indonesia wants to play, or what role it will play in Asia's changing security architecture. But as many of you know, Indonesia has many internal problems that could derail its progress. Now, these haven't been the subject of my current research, but I think it's just interesting to touch on a few nevertheless. The first problem that I see in Indonesia is corruption and overregulation. Economic freedom has not kept up with political freedom. The Heritage Foundation gives Indonesia a score of 56 out of 100 for economic freedom, which is not a great score. Corruption has become even worse since decentralisation because there's just more levels of government to bribe. Transparency International gives Indonesia a score of 2.8 out of 10 on its Corruption Perceptions Index. It's really hard to know where overregulation stops and corruption begins in Indonesia, and I sort of liken the situation to the old licence Raj days in India. This has become a major impediment to economic activity and just daily life. Foreign investors are put off by the uncertainty. Infrastructure spending is held up. It's extremely hard to start a business. Something as simple as renewing your driver's license is a really costly and time-consuming process. Many poor people don't have legal title over their land because they simply just can't afford the bribe that's needed to do it. So there's real problems with enforcing property rights. Incredibly restrictive labour laws make it very difficult to hire and fire staff, and Indonesia has one of the highest minimum wages in the region, making it hard to compete with its neighbours. This is also playing into protectionist tendencies. There's great opposition amongst many Indonesians to the ASEAN-China free trade agreement because workers do fear that they're going to lose their jobs to cheaper competitors. The second problem, which is related, is one of weak institutions. Such rampant corruption and inefficient bureaucracy is able to exist because of the weakness of Indonesia's main democratic institutions. In recent months, a spectacular case of a corrupt mid-ranking tax officials hit the headlines. What's so interesting about the case is not just the audacity of the official, who was actually filmed at a tennis tournament in Bali in a disguise when he was supposed to be in jail. It's also the way that the case has exposed corruption within the courts, the police, the parliament, the tax office. Basically every government institution that's been involved has been implicated in some way. In the middle of last year, the reform-minded finance minister resigned from parliament to take up a post at the World Bank. Now, it's widely assumed that she was pushed out due to pressure from Suharto-era cronies who are still in parliament, whose financial interests were endangered by her reform agenda. This really leaves question marks over A, how committed is President Yudhoyono to reform, or how much control does he actually have over the parliament, and whether things have really changed much since the Suharto-era days of crony capitalism. Another institution with a question mark over it is the military. Now, under Suharto, they had a philosophy of dual function of military and political operations, and this doesn't exist anymore. They have less influence in politics and have divested themselves of many of their own assets. But really, we still don't know how effective reform's been. A recent case of 2 soldiers torturing Papuan civilians, which was caught on video and made its way around the world on YouTube, has again brought question marks about the professionalism of the military. Beyond this, there's also doubts about the military's capacity to protect Indonesia in any significant way. Indonesia spends about 1% of GDP on defence, much less than any of its neighbours. A massive cash injection is probably needed to bring the military up to standard, but where will the cash come from? Another problem with the lack of money is poor infrastructure. It's extremely difficult to move goods around the country because roads, bridges, ports, often where they're supposed to be there, they're just not there. It can take 3 to 4 hours to get from Jakarta to the airport because of traffic problems. Just this week, there's a case of a 12-kilometre long traffic jam of trucks trying to get into the port city of Malacca after 14 of the 33 ferries that are servicing the route fell into disrepair. Many of the truck drivers that are stuck in this traffic jam have got cargo that's food, perishable, and they have to write it off. And authorities are now saying it's going to take 5 days to clear the traffic jam. And this is just one example. So these bottlenecks are a major impediment to economic development, and yet efforts to fix them are often sidelined by corruption and ineffective government institutions. So again, the issues are all playing into each other. Another issue is poverty. Indonesia is still very much a developing country. Officially 15% of the population live in poverty, but it's sort of widely thought that the line is set too low. Almost half of the population live on less than the equivalent of $2 a day. What this also means is that Indonesia is incredibly sensitive to food and fuel inflation. Remember, this ultimately led to the downfall of Suharto. So as we see food price rises again happening, we could see problems develop in Indonesia. The government in Indonesia spends a huge chunk of its national budget on fuel subsidies for households. The World Bank estimates that between 2001 and 2008, it spent somewhere between 10 and 28% of the national budget on fuel subsidies. Economists almost universally agree that the subsidies have to go, but politically, because of the history with Suharto, there's something of a political sacred cow. When oil prices rise, the government has often upped the subsidy rather than pass on the cost to consumers because it doesn't want to risk the political unrest that could come with increasing fuel costs. In its budget this year, the government is spending twice as much on food and fuel subsidies as it is on infrastructure, twice as much as it is on defence, and probably a third as much as it is on all social welfare programs. So it's a huge chunk of its spending. The final issue I'll talk about is extremism. Indonesia is a majority Muslim country, and in the post-Suharto period there's been something of a resurgence of Islam. And I think this is partly as part of a global trend, but it's also partly because there's now less control on civil society, so people have more freedom to exercise their religion. Nevertheless, Indonesian Muslims tend to be politically secular. Muslim parties don't get a big showing in elections. The biggest party, the PKS, got 8% of the vote in the 2009 elections, and this was really part of a general slump in support for Islamist parties, which have got progressively less in each election since we've moved to democracy. Islamic parties don't really push for Sharia law or an Islamic state simply because they found that there's just very little voter appeal in doing so. There's not any votes in it. There's also widespread public support for the government's crackdown on JI and on terrorism, and there's very little public support for figures such as Abu Bakr Bashir. But nevertheless, there are some worrying signs that extremism is on the rise. Suharto saw Islamists as a threat to the unity of the state, and he crushed religious violence swiftly. There are some fears now that because of the looser controls on the population, extremist elements have been able to bloom. There have been a number of violent incidents in recent months involving attacks on both Christian groups and also on the breakaway Muslim sect, the Ahmadiyya. Particularly in the case of the Ahmadiyya, the government in Jakarta has responded very weakly. In fact, some senior ministers have actually publicly condemned the sect that was being attacked rather than the attackers. Both Islamic and secular parties have been known to take advantage of populist Muslim sentiment for their own political advantage. There's also some elements of religious conservatism creeping into the government. The communications minister is a member of the PKS party, part of a very broad coalition, and in 2008 he sponsored an anti-pornography law. This has seen in the last few months him place restrictions on Blackberries because it's thought that they might carry pornographic content. And also a very popular pop star was sentenced to jail after a homemade sex tape appeared on YouTube. This conservatism doesn't extend across the government, but again there's concerns about whether Yudhoyono is really doing enough or can do much to rein it in. Indonesia is a genuine emerging power. It will become increasingly important in the region. And in the future, I think we could talk about Indonesia as a major Asian power along the lines of India or Japan. Indonesia's main foreign policy conundrum is the balancing act between both China and the US, but also within these two relationships. But currently, it's doing a pretty good job of this. In fact, it would be quite happy to preserve the status quo for as long as possible. Indonesia's day-to-day foreign policy focus will continue to be on ASEAN, but really this can be seen as part of a